Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When you think about the years of 1861 to 1865, a lot of names come to mind. The most common one is the Civil War, but depending on where you are in the country, and if you're really from the Deep South, you might refer to it as the War between the States, the War of Northern Aggression, the War for Southern Independence. All the names are actually correct, but it just depends geographically where you are. But the Civil War has sparked many books, many films, many debates, and most likely will continue to do so for, well, as long as there is the United States of America, and the study of its history will always occur. Now, because of this, a lot of people sometimes speculate as to what it was that it was like to live at this time, since today we'd have no one left to actually tell us what it was like. And so, because of the speculation, a lot of assumptions can be made and a lot of misconceptions can occur. But in today's episode, we hope to correct that with the help of the Executive Director of the National Civil War Life Foundation, Mr. Terry Thomann. Terry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a real privilege to be here.
I'm glad you're here, and I have to admit, I've never heard of the foundation before, and so, I'm pretty confident most of the viewing audience hasn't either. So, what is the foundation?
The National Civil War Life Foundation was established about 3 years ago. A group of people who are dedicated to telling the story of the lives of people in America during the Civil War. Not just Northerners or Southerners, but both sides of the war, plus the civilians, and the stories of the African Americans' experience as slaves or as free blacks.
And so, what do you find is their greatest challenge in trying to present this information to people? Because clearly this can be a very sensitive issue to some people.
It is a very sensitive issue, and what we are striving to do is to be as accurate and non-biased in telling the story as we can. We have to use original source material so that we can quote the people that were there, not people today who would like to interpret the way it was. We use actual artifacts to tell the stories. It's a much better way to let people find out what the story was through the artifacts that belong to the people that were involved.
And how do you collect your artifacts?
Well, I have been a Civil War collector most of my life. I've been collecting for 50 years. So the collection that we're using for the museum is my personal collection. And I acquire artifacts through a lot of different ways. A lot of them come from other collectors, people, networking that I have established over the years, but some come from dealers, some come through internet sources, just a wide range of sources. Some things are just brought into the museum and people either want to donate or sell them.
Now, when it comes to your telling of the story, do you hope to actually have reenactors and interpreters portraying this role throughout the foundation, or do you want to have the infamous, here's a wall of pictures and words, and you read and attempt to learn? How do you want to present this information to people?
Very good question. I really don't like museums that have a lot of images and text panels on the wall. It's been my experience from just observing visitors to those museums that a lot of people just walk right by them, so they're missing the story. So what we're going to do is use key artifacts to tell the story, along with a little bit of text so that they get the information that they need, that they can process, so that they can determine what in their mind is the actual story of the Civil War.
Now, what got you interested in the Civil War? Since you're the executive director and you're a collector, you want to tell the story of the war, clearly something had to have inspired you to get into this, because I had a professor years ago say you can spend an entire lifetime studying the Civil War and only scratch the surface.
It's absolutely true. And Andrew, that's a great question. It's my favorite question that people ask me. And I always like to acknowledge my 7th grade history teacher, Mr. Raymond Finelli. Back in Illinois, He was one of those 1 in a million teachers who has the ability to take a subject like American history and get the entire class interested and enthusiastic about it. He always started off his semester on the Civil War by saying, I want you to understand there were no good guys and no bad guys in the Civil War. All of these people were fighting for what they believed in, and we cannot judge them by today's standards. You have to study history. You have to learn to judge them by the standards of the day. And that really stuck with me, and I've dedicated my Civil War interest to being as much like that and as non-biased and factual as I can. So thank you, Mr. Finelli. He was great.
Well, certainly teachers can play a very influential role in this regard. Now, based off of what he says, you cannot judge by today's standards. And with you saying you want to be as unbiased as possible, for those who are interested in the Civil War, how difficult is it to stay unbiased?
It's very difficult because there's so much written about the Civil War. The Civil War is probably the single subject with the most books written about it, especially if you include all the books about Abraham Lincoln. But you have to, and I have always striven to, any book that I read, to check the references that they use to see that they are getting their information not from their own imagination, but from what actually happened at the time. You have to read sources from both sides because sometimes they'll contradict. And sometimes it requires you to make some decisions. And that's what we want to do in this museum. We want people to be able to come to their own conclusions. We do not tell people what happened. We give them facts and information and let them come to a conclusion.
Now, since you want people to come to a conclusion, this is obviously going to be very tricky depending on presentation. But let's go ahead and try to do like a role play example for people so they have an idea. And I see on the table we have a couple artifacts here for us. Mm-hmm. Now, before we begin with this nice little role play exercise, can you tell us what the artifacts are so then we all have everything in context?
Okay, great, yeah. We have 2 revolvers that I brought here. This revolver is a Colt, belonged to a Union colonel that fought in many of the battles of the Civil War. He was a very courageous officer. And the whole point of the pistol is not to tell so much his story, but to tell the story of men like him. And there were thousands like him. So we use the artifact to connect with those people. The other revolver is a Confederate revolver. It's a copy of the Colt, but because of shortages of material and trained mechanics, it was not very successful. And I'd just like to point out that this one, the entire side of the cylinder exploded. So, but the other side of the story, this tells the story of the Confederates trying to arm themselves. But the other interesting fact is that these revolvers were made by slaves. And a lot of people don't realize when you think of slaves, thinking of them as trained, skilled machinists. And they were. And so I think it tells several aspects of the Civil War. And that's one of the things we really look for in an artifact, is something that tells something unique about the Civil War. And the third item I have here is a letter written by a woman by the name of Amanda Holmes. She had been a slave. She had been freed in 1859. And the letter she is writing to a woman by the name of Mrs. Harrison, and she's asking Mrs. Harrison if she would not please sell her children. And if you will not sell me my children, will you hire them to me? This woman, this letter tells the tragedy of slavery probably better than any artifact I've ever seen. The separation of families was the greatest tragedy in slavery. And this woman was trying to put her family back together. She was able to buy her husband out of slavery. She did not get her children until the end of the war, when all the slaves were freed and the entire family was reunited. So it has a happy ending.
Well, that's always good to have.
It's a great artifact. And that's the kind of thing that we try to use to tell those stories.
Okay, now, in this little role playing, so if I'm the visitor and I were to see these two pistols, how would you want to present these two pistols for me in trying to tell a story of the Civil War? How would you want it to be reflected?
Very good question. Artifacts, many times you go to a museum and you'll see, for example, a collection of guns. There'll be row after row after row of guns. And to the average visitor, they all look alike. To me, that is an example of an exhibit in depth. We don't do that. We feel that artifacts should be displayed in context. So Colonel Cross's revolver is displayed with an Irish Brigade sword from the Battle of Fredericksburg. And so the Confederate revolver is displayed with things that are in context with it to help illustrate the point that we're trying to make. So you won't see a whole row of pistols with little name cards on them. They will all be displayed in a context with a story that makes a certain point.
Now, obviously people will come to the museum and they want to have different things, but as an educator myself, one of the things that's always vitally important is what kind of educational resources are available to be found in regards to the Civil War life, because most elementary schools will do the occasional colonial day and their kids can get really involved. But as you get older, you notice that there's really nothing to involve people into the Civil War unless you really go out of your way to do this. And so in trying to involve people into the Civil War, what could educators find as wonderful resources provided by you?
Okay, that's another good question. To start with, they will have an opportunity to see these artifacts and to learn these stories in context, in a context that's meaningful and important. But also what we have in our museum is a Civil War 3D show. It was put together by us and the Center for Civil War Photography. And it's about a 20-minute program. You have to wear the funny little glasses. And, but you will see a number of Civil War photographs that were taken on the battlefields, in the camps around Washington, that were taken in 3D at the time. They were meant to be seen in 3D. And we got the images from the Library of Congress through scans of their original glass plate negatives. So they're very sharp. This is one way we feel that young people really get excited about the Civil War, because they see something new. It's not just like looking at pictures in a book. This is something that you really get into these. And it helps to spark their interest in the other artifacts. So, and some hands-on things too that we do. For example, we've got 2 iron armor plates from a Confederate gunboat, the CSS Jackson. And we didn't display them up on the wall or put them behind glass. They're actually on the floor. And we encourage people to actually stand on them and understand that they're standing on the deck of a Civil War ironclad.
Wow.
So it's little things like that that you could do with something like that, and you're not going to hurt them by standing on them. They've been in a river for 150 years. But it gives people something to touch, something to feel, and something to do, so that it makes their visit much more exciting and meaningful.
Now, I'm a firm believer in hands-on myself. Being able to touch something and actually physically feel it, it creates a better connection. Now, you mentioned, these plates have been under a river for almost 150 years. And ironically enough, we are now coming up to the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. And until we get to the year 2015, we'll still be at 150 of everything.
Right.
And so my question for the 150th is there anything special you're hoping to do in order to commemorate this?
Well, really, there's 2 things. We want to get our museum established in a permanent facility where we can fulfill our mission. That's critical. That's key. The second thing that we are doing is our board of directors has decided that they would like us to host an annual symposium. And we're calling it the Richard Kirkland Symposium. Now, Richard Kirkland was the Angel of Mary's Heights. He was the Confederate soldier who, at the risk of his own life, went out onto the battlefield to give water and blankets to the wounded Union soldiers. A great story, and one that connects very well with us, because our foundation's motto is "We drank from the same canteen," which really kind of pulls together that thought that the veterans had, that we are all brothers in arms after all. We were on different sides, but we're still brothers. And it's that fellowship and brothership that we're trying to emphasize. We don't try to emphasize the differences between the North and the South. We try to emphasize what they had in common and the fact that they were all Americans and that everyone that was killed in the Civil War was an American. So the Richard Kirkland seminar that we're going to do annually, probably around the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg anniversary,
Makes sense.
will focus on topics like that, topics of fellowship, of soldiers' lives and how they impacted, how a son being missing from a family to go off to war impacted, say, a farm family in Pennsylvania. It's not going to always be about Richard Kirkland, but it's going to be about themes that are inspired by that type of thing.
Well, and certainly being able to discuss these things and have an understanding of it is important. And so, in trying to educate the public, obviously you have grander goals right now. And so, what kind of difficulties have you encountered in trying to create this vision? Because in everything I've seen, there's always people who want to try to show things from the past, and you're going to have that one bad apple who decides to try to ruin the whole thing by saying, oh, no, you can't do it this way. What kind of difficulties do you find in trying to present information from both sides, or from every aspect, really? I'm sure you've probably encountered some kind of difficulty.
Difficulties have been very rare for us. We've been operating the museum on a temporary location basis for almost 10 years. And occasionally a visitor will vehemently disagree with something that the museum presents. But for the most part, because we're so focused on being fair and unbiased and even-handed, that everyone generally can come away with something that they strongly agree with. And we've been very happy with the results that we've gotten from that.
You really can't go wrong then if you aren't getting that many complaints.
Yeah, I'll just give you a little example. One of our exhibits was on the cause of the Civil War, and that's a very, very hotly contested subject. And we presented facts from the original time period on both sides, but we kind of tried to sum it up with a statement that a friend of mine made one time, which was basically that if all the issues of the day were compared to a game of pickup sticks, you could not move the slavery stick without upsetting the entire pile. So no matter what issue you were focusing on, that slavery stick was always going to affect the whole pile. And I think most people do resonate with that and understand that that is true. There are people who say, oh, slavery had nothing to do with the war, and people who say that was the only thing that it had to do with, but I think everybody realizes that no matter what issue they had, the slavery issue was always there.
Well, that's true. It's always there, and it's always one that comes back continuously. Even the national battlefields have to discuss these things, and other museums discuss these things. And so in discussing the Civil War, you always get that certain sense of pride when you want to talk about things. And so my question now is that since this is your personal collection, this is one that you have built, this is like your baby, so to speak, what's your favorite piece? What's the piece to you that says, this is definitive?
Boy, that's hard. probably one of my favorite pieces is it's a fence rail. At the Battle of Antietam, there was an area called the Bloody Lane.
Mm-hmm.
There was a wooden fence in front of the Bloody Lane. And a company of Massachusetts soldiers were sent forward to tear a hole in that fence so the rest of the Corps could come through. The officer went into that fight with 76 men. He came out with 6 alive. That was a tremendous act of heroism. 10 years after the Civil War, this officer went back to the battles that he had fought in and toured them and visited Antietam and recovered this particular fence rail from the rebuilt fence. It has bullets embedded in it and things like that. And this meant a lot to him, and it means a lot to us because it speaks of the dedication of both sides to defend a position or to take the position. And it's just, it's one of those artifacts that you say, boy, if this could only talk, it would really tell a story.
Well, it would probably have a big echo considering
Yeah.
the amount of bullets that went flying around at that time. And so, and that's just an amazing story right there. Just saying, what does this post have to say about the Civil War? And it kind of makes you wonder a little bit about it. Now, since you're in a temporary location, if anyone wanted to come visit you in the near future, where do we go?
Well, we're located in downtown Fredericksburg, right on Caroline Street, in the heart of the historic district. It's 829 Caroline Street, and we're open every day, Monday through Saturday, 10 to 5, Sunday, noon to 5. And we're always there. The 3D show runs continuously, so you can just go in anytime and see it. We encourage people to come in, bring their kids. The people that visit the museum, for as small and a temporary exhibit as it is, we're finding that people are spending sometimes an hour or more in there because what we've done with our collection is take the best of the best and really condense the collection and break it down into a couple of main areas like infantry and artillery and photography, things like that. So, and medical and music, things like that.
Now, since you're only condensing the best as a presentation, how many artifacts do you really have then?
We have about 2,000 artifacts, but we have about 300 on display.
So just a little over 10% is on display.
Yeah.
Now, do you switch these out, or is this just going to be the 10%?
No, we do rotate things because some of the stuff is just too cool to leave it in storage. We have to get it out every once in a while.
Now, is there a hidden gem that you want to try, that you're hoping maybe, maybe for the 150th next year, you're going to bring out and say, here it is, the Feast de Resistance.
Probably one of the most interesting pieces, but also one of the most difficult ones to display, is a regimental field desk. It's a wooden box with a front that folds down to become the writing surface, and it's got pigeonholes and slots. The neat thing about it is when we got it, it still had all the original records in it from 1865.
Oh my gosh.
This soldier took this desk with all of its contents, bundles of documents tied up in little red ribbons and books and things, took them back to his farm in Iowa where they stayed until about 8 years ago when we found it and we were able to buy it and bring it. So we want to build a display around this centerpiece item and call it the Buy the Book.